Hello, everyone. Welcome. There's echo. Welcome, everyone, right? This is Kun Park, Associate Dean for Academics for College of Architecture. And this is my pleasure, actually, introducing Viola Ago, who is actually doing an in-person lecture for first time, actually, in this semester. Viola is an, let me introduce her briefly. Viola is an Albanian architectural designer, educator, and practitioner. She's a directs Miracles Architecture and teaches at the School of Architecture and Urban Design at UCLA. Viola was awarded to Wortham Fellowship at Ryerson University and the Yessios Visiting Fellowship at Ohio State University, Knowlton School of Architecture, and Muschenheim Fellowship at the University of Michigan, Taubman School of Architecture. Viola earned her M.Arch degree from SCI-Arc and B. Architectural Science from Ryerson University at Toronto. Her written work has been published by Routledge, Park Books, and Wiley, as well as in Log, AD Magazine, Offramp, Acadia Conference Proceedings, JAE, and Architects Newspaper, name a few. Her design and research work has been exhibited in Los Angeles, Boston, Houston, Ghent, New York, San Francisco, Miami, Columbia, Ann Arbor, and Cincinnati throughout basically the United States. It is my pleasure, and let's welcome Viola.
All right. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction, and hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining in person and online. I'm really happy to be here. I have dearly missed the in-person lecture format, actually, as I'm sure a lot of you have. I've enjoyed over the last couple of years seeing a lot of lectures online, but the webinar format, I think, and the Q&A and all those other items are not quite the same, I would say, as in-person lectures, but it sustained us. Anyway, all that to say is that I'm really happy to see you all here in person, and I think it makes an enormous difference. All right, so I want to begin, of course, with some gratitude by thanking Chair Jeffrey Nesbitt for the invitation to the school. I also want to thank the administrative staff for all the behind-the-scenes support for making this possible. And lastly, I'm so happy to share my work with colleagues and friends whose work I have admired for a very long time also. So thank you again for this opportunity. All right. So today I'll begin talking about a few things that I loosely refer to as architectural design attitudes and how these attitudes are informed by lyrical force rather than narrative or canonical conditions. And most importantly, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of a mode of axes rather than a binary. And in this particular case, I'd like to introduce an axis between violence and aggression and how this has guided some of my design and research work in architecture. All right, so I've built this lecture on these three main parts, starting with the violence and aggression axes that I was just talking about, and also how this axis linked with lyrical force and the methodology of empathetic experiences can help guide us as creative workers towards design proposals in architecture that are impactful. So I must note that it is actually impact that I'm after, not necessarily solutions, not progress, and not good or bad impact either, because I truly believe that the moment that we give in to the sort of Western-centric evaluative criteria based on singular opposing qualities, such as good versus bad, we are by default giving into the kind of authoritative watchdog ideologies. So I hope with this lecture that I can show how my work attempts to sit comfortably in the now and the present with all the things that already exist in it, and in an attempt to occupy a pluralistic landscape. Okay, so I want to start by playing this video installation artwork by Theaster Gates. I'm not sure if there's going to be sound in it, but if there is, all the better. This piece is titled "Gone Are the Days of Shelter and Martyr." And this was part of a seminal group exhibition at the New Museum in New York City just this past May. Well, I guess last year's May, titled "Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America." The exhibition was based on the curatorial works of Akwe and Wazir. All right, so the video shows a recording of a performance that was part scripted, part improvised on site, where an intimate but very intense group of musicians occupy the abandoned and dilapidated St. Lawrence Church in South Shore, Chicago. According to Gates, the church had been a very important venue for the local community. It was meant to be demolished, and this news of the demolition, even though it was dilapidated, was devastating to that same community. So in the performance, the musicians use their bodies to physically move imminent artifacts that are already in the church, and it's the resultant sounds that ephemerally activate the complex history of the church. So there is a force and there's violence in the scene, multi-layered and multifaceted. But in my opinion, this installation offers a fascinating example for work that zeroes in on the relationship between politics and architecture. And it's even more relevant for our current moment because our material and immaterial, more importantly, even states of duress are ever so present. So with this in mind, I would argue that it's impossible to imagine an architectural space where the politics of violence are not considered. Okay, all great, but I did not come up with this. So I am focusing and basing this on Franz Fanon's theories of violence and aggression. Fanon was a psychiatrist and a political philosopher who was quite influential in the fields of critical theory and post-colonial studies. In his 1961 book, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon sketches an immersive parallel between the colonizer and the colonized in his chapter on violence. He describes the colonizer's imposed value system as violence and the response of the colonized as aggression. This, in my opinion, weighs quite heavily in 2021, 60 years after the book's publication. And to me, it rings even truer to me now than it did then. But then again, how would I know that? I was not alive at that time. So odd as it may be, I also wanted to bring in Bruno Latour into the conversation. And I want to talk a little bit about this question of the immanent versus the transcendental, or the immanent to the transcendental axes. So Latour's composition theory aligns with the critique of the modernist notion of progress, and with it, the kind of part to whole logics. Latour's theory is concerned with the immanent conditions of what is already in the world. So thinking back to the church installation, things were already present in the dilapidation condition of the church. In other words, the theory composes existing things in non-hierarchical and non-totalizing organizations, as opposed to the modernist transcendental model, where you're supposed to kind of transcendent as a subject viewing or experiencing a thing. So to illustrate this, he uses Thomas Harasano's work, Galaxies Forming Along Filaments Like Droplets Along the Strands of a Spider Web from 2009. He uses this as a kind of visual metaphor that resists hierarchical order and center points, and instead creates highly intricate conditions of nesting and interdependence onto flat ontological schemes. What I like to question, however, and I invite you to think about this as well, is are Latour and Sarasano failing to escape the sort of stronghold of abstraction? Are they still rooted in this kind of idea of like a metaphor? Which again, like abstraction metaphor, there's still these kind of like modernist and by extension, I would argue, exclusionary conditions. Again, change takes time. This was already 10 years ago, so we'll give them the benefit of the doubt and hope that we're just all taking baby steps. All right, so in looking past the binary model and towards methods that are enmeshed and fluid, I want to lastly turn for another quick moment to another primary idea postulated by anthropologist Tim Ingold. So in brief, Ingold argues for the method of continuum that he refers to as meshing or correspondence. So instead of reinforcing the typical kind of delamination of event and perception, he proposes that the event and its perception occur simultaneously because the two are in correspondence with one another. So simply put, the creative and perceptive events occur alongside one another. So the way that I like to think about this in relationship to the violence and aggression that we were just talking about is that these two things are actually happening simultaneously, though we may not see them, because oftentimes these types of occurrences are immaterial. But we'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. All right. So in the question of like material and immaterial axes, I want to turn to forensic architecture's Isle Weitzman for another moment. In introducing his book, Forensic Architecture, Violence at the Threshold of Detectability, Weitzman begins by describing the imperative role that architecture played in legal courts during the trials of David Irving, who was one of the most notorious and dangerous Holocaust deniers of our time. Weitzman convincingly argues that buildings, architectural artifacts, register and remember atrocities committed during violent moments in history, which is especially helpful when forensic matter does not survive the crime scenes. So in these cases, it's the material architectural remains that act as witnesses to retell stories that are so often denied by nationalists or religious extremists, nefarious governmental bodies or individuals, paramilitary groups, and so on. These denials happen in tandem with other highly dangerous conditions, unfortunately, as most often is the case. For example, I won't get into too much detail here for the purpose of today's lecture, but in the Balkan conflict, for instance, where a lot of my research is focused, it is primarily because of the extreme geopolitical current conditions in its history. So in the region, investigative journalism and UN commissions point to foreign interventions giving rise to already existing ethnic tensions that could lead to another war. In a most recent example, a neo-nationalist member of the unstable tripartite presidency in Bosnia, for instance, unfathomably denied the Srebrenica massacre of 1995, which is considered the worst European genocide since World War II. So, in another example, not directly tied to the Balkan conflict and the wars over the years, this is another recent tension rising area in Armenia, yet another highly complex geopolitical problem, which is intricately tied to religion and ethnicity. And here we see again a struggle for overcoming this denier paradox in the midst of political and ethnic tensions. So to return to Weitzman's proposal from earlier, luckily in our present day, we have media and technology that can detect, register, record violent acts, and therefore denials have become just a bit more difficult from the material standpoint. However, I'm thinking that a different kind of denial has started to emerge, and oftentimes government sanctioned, they are government sanctioned and corporation backed. So, as I would like to argue is the case here. So here we see a most recent proposal by MVRDV, a firm that I have to admit that I deeply respected in the late aughts when I was starting to study architecture. This proposal here is titled the Gagarian Valley. I only recently came across it, and I'm still making my way to try to understand the complexities of this proposal. But here's a quote from one of the founding and one of the more active partners at MVRDV, Vinny Mas. He says, the area is named after Yuri Gagarin, who was the first human to orbit the Earth. He saw the planet's vulnerability, a house in need of extra care, as many other astronauts have since stressed. I share the concern. Stimulating biodiversity, improving water management, and the ecosystem is of great importance for the future of the Gagarin Valley and the world. The valley can be seen as a series of test fields for the 10,000 species that will soon flourish there, an enrichment that will give the area the appearance of a Garden of Eden. Okay, end quote. So I think we could take probably an entire hour to unpack that one statement alone. We're not going to do that, but I simply wanted to stress the complex of the Western sort of like male savior coming in to a destabilized nation to act the hero, and on top of it, to, in my opinion, even dare and refer to the development in biblical terms, keeping in mind here that religion is one of the primary leading causes of the conflict and the subsequent genocide in the region. Okay, so here's another most recent example, a proposal in the most typical kind of Western corporate aesthetic, smooth glass, steel panels, flushness, and so on, lighting scenes and other aspects like this. This is for a performing arts theater. It's designed by big architects. And this theater proposal is to be built on a site where the old historical theater set, which was illegally demolished in the capital city of Albania. So therefore, this new proposal that is admittedly shaped as a bow tie, as far as I know, a fashion article is associated with male and masculinity, I would say, erases and denies any and all historical layers that existed in the original fabric of the old theater, the old historical theater. This kind of invisible and stealthy form of denial has started to take place in parts of the world that are still, in a way, picking up the pieces from extreme violent events in their recent past, from wars, colonization, genocide, and so on. Oftentimes, these places are in regions that are in the developing world, if we needed like another term to yet contend with. In any case, it seems to me that Western corporate aesthetic has been sold to the non-West as a kind of one-way ticket towards modernization, and with it, so-called progress. This approach has not only failed to contribute to said progress, but in addition, it's also tragically erased the history of a place by building an architecture which has limited to non-existent relationships with its history or its complex layers of history. So this is a type of cleansing mechanism that denies the history of a place in favor of an aesthetic production that is maliciously offered as progressive. The deployment of this type of architecture practice has historically led to the surge of unregulated neoliberal urbanization schemes that encourage division and hostility over reconciliation. So here's another example of the capital of Serbia, which is another extremely contested and complicated site in the Balkans. And I also want to point out the denial of place in the guise of progressive Western aesthetic is always brought to these lands, or almost always, by foreign intervention and investment. Okay. So I'm actually going to take my mask off. Does that violate any COVID guidance? Okay, because I'm having a really hard time breathing with it. Okay, so what do we do with all of this? And how is this relevant to creative agents in architecture? And even more of an impossible question is how and why should we care? So to get to that, I'd like to read this one excerpt by Jarius Grove from his recent book, Savage Ecology, War and Geopolitics at the End of the World. Okay, so in his chapter on violence as a form of life, Grove writes, to put it more bluntly, politics, colonialism, settlement, capitalism, ecological destruction, racism, and misogynies are not war by other means, they are war. War is not a metaphor, it is an intensive fabric of relations making the Eurocene. So in all, Grove argues that war is central to us being. It's a form of life. War is everywhere. And as such, he refers to war in the present day as a way of being in the world and becoming with the world. So it does not exist over there as we mostly think about it. So my takeaway from this is that we are, by definitions, all agents of war. This might sound a little bit far-fetched at first, but being in the United States, for example, and being members in any way in the system, which is violent in its structure, we cannot escape the system. So again, this is what Grove calls a form of life. And with that in mind, this all means that by definition, we are weaponized entities. And in turn, we are implicated in the violence and aggression axes that I was just speaking about earlier. And this is not just as architects, this is just as kind of like members of a system. All right, so I'm going to take a quick break from the framework and present a speculative project that is still in progress that attempts to propose an alternative aesthetic position and formal apparatus that I hope can respond to this violent form of life that we occupy, whether it's conscious or not. So in my work, I argue that elements in a composition that register transformations from physical impact can embody the creative force behind the conflicts, this kind of conflict-centric form of life that I was just describing. So here we see a kind of snippets of an animation sequence of panels that seem to tremble from a hosting frame underneath. It's barely visible, but the frame is in red. It looks better on my screen, sorry. This is a panel-based composition simulation. It proposes it in the form of a pavilion. In this case, we see a roof-like structure that seems to kind of have missed its host entirely and is suddenly resting on the ground. We see that it's kind of blanketed in this sort of like red graphic that is, it's a little bit like pictorially similar to its surrounding, but it's also digitally altered to unrealistic and almost undesirable red tones and hues in an attempt to extend our visual imaginary. And in addition, while the main structure seems that it's clad in these coherently aligned and perfectly joined panels, the panels are in fact mismatched, they're shifted in order to highlight a kind of disjointedness, a sort of turbulence that was simulated using digital physics engines. And here we can see it sort of like circled in the diagram B4 on the bottom right. Okay. And then here we see the animation of one of the digital simulations that is using turbulence as a force that destabilizes frames from a predetermined perfect position. So I want to start pointing to the question of process here, and that it is in this experiential space that I hope to engage with the disruptive and these other kinds of disruptive like qualities that have been typically referred to as either undesirable or treated as sort of like hindering rather than being beneficial in any way. And here we see a rendered view of the pavilion. So this is to be thought of as kind of like one possible instantiation that was derived from the digital simulation. It's not necessarily supposed to be seen as a kind of final project or a final outcome. And then another theme that I will discuss consistently in this talk is process and process proper. In fact, in one of my recent publications, I called process a dirty word in architecture because we sort of went through another phase where it was no longer desirable to talk about it and where we had to focus on the kind of like the final project and the sort of like bestowing of that final project onto our psyche. But this version seen here, again, it's an extracted frame from the animation sequence, from the process. So the animation sequence is thought of as a process. And therefore, this proposal exists in the same space as the process itself that generated it. So in other words, you can't sort of like hide this thing of this like rendering thing without the animate, forceful event that created the thing itself, or at least that's the hope. And here again, I wanted to highlight the kind of the graphic application of the work. It's another consistent aspect in my work and practice. This graphic condition operates in a similar way, just as the material parts, or in this case, just like the panels, the transparent panels. So the graphic, it carries with it a sort of digital residue of other sort of like graphic based conditions that have been developed through similar digital tools of forces acting on a dematerialized layer that has been kind of like haphazardly wrapped and stretched and skewed onto a cluster of panels. All right, so these inquiries are not new to architecture, however. The deconstructivists, for example, they worked with similar methods of inquiry. Here we see Eisenman's Max Reinhardt house, which was developed as an event of a rectangular shape, as you can see on the diagram on the left, the rectangular shape that traces a Mobius curve in 3D space. But the process here is also very much the product. The deconstructivists were working through projects that also, in a way, defined the laws of physics. They confronted wholeness with finite libraries of elements. They challenged this like kind of question of geometric truths as we knew them at the time. And they resisted conventional typologies and assemblies. And it was a kind of reaction towards their parented kind of leftover architectural style. Another example here by Dan Libeskind, and I could fill an entire lecture with examples from the deconstructivists. However, what I want to point to is that a decon eventually inevitably also became a style, even though the originators claimed that they were very much interested in ideas, and as such argued that its placement in the canon as a style was in a way antithetical to its original ambitions. True, I'm in line with this thinking also, but this is also not a new phenomenon. This happens quite often in architecture. New architectural ideas do not necessarily seek to establish a new style, but they do, however, lead to movements, and movements gain momentum, and then momentum essentially lays the groundwork for the establishment of style. It seems like it's something that we can't necessarily escape, although we can always try. Okay, but one of the aspects that I think distinguishes the decons from some of the work that we see now is that those projects could not necessarily escape the evaluative problem. And I do truly believe that this is a problem. It's the one that establishes the kind of like watchdog ideology that, that I was talking about earlier. So taking cues from visual dynamics and even just basalt theory, the decons were ultimately working towards architectural effects that were rooted in the visual experience. So one thinks of Theodor Lipps, Rudolf Arnheim's, for example, perceptual mimetic psychology theories, visual dynamics, to kind of qualify the work. Again, here we talk about the finalized work, so work in its true state. The final thing is the one that is acting on to the viewing subject. So as an instance here, Arnheim argues that when a viewing subject is confronted with, for example, an anthropomorphic phenomenon, that we ultimately read the rest of the scene from that standpoint. So in this example on the photograph on the right, he argues that we're defaulted to associate the diagonal handrail to the diagonal posture of the sleeping person in front of an otherwise quite orthogonally organized building facade. So this setup is simply, in my opinion, inadequate for our current moment. My hyper-focus turned to process rather than that sort of finalized kind of frozen scenes as a final project, as the only true sort of position of a project. In the space of going back to Tim Ingold's correspondence, I'm trying to think of ways that we can avoid stylistic concerns, that we can avoid those sort of the nature of vetted schemes or projects that have been left over in this kind of trajectory of architectural history, in favor of more aleatory positions and other and not just in architecture, but also in other creative disciplines as well. So turning to Edith Stein's phenomenology of empathy, she is much more concerned with the kind of the method of phenomenology rather than, so in terms of like the process of receiving and perceiving, rather than evaluating the finalized thing like Theodor Lipps was. I'd like to borrow her term fusion to describe a kind of axis, a different kind of axis, but an axis nonetheless. And I started to call this thing a fusion axis. So I refer to here as the kind of miraculous moment when the sensorial body and the physical body of an individual fuse in abstract space while experiencing a foreign thing in the world. And this becomes really important when we talk about creative acts. So more specifically, the fusion axis characterizes the moment when an individual's perception-like empathy communicates between their sensorial and their physical body, and subsequently, the individual makes the decision to interact with the process in a particular way. And again, this process would change drastically from one person to the next. So again, going back to the physics engine simulation that we just saw a few slides ago, that means that it is in this space of an empathetic experience that an author, for instance, is inclined to click and alter the input parameters that either destabilizes a roof, adds turbulence to panels of a structure, melts a digital graphic layer, as we saw in the kind of red hues in the earlier, some of the earlier slides. Okay. So with the framework in mind of embracing a kind of imminent condition of violence, turning to process, and resting in a space of correspondence or a sensorial or physiognomic axes, I want to turn to some of my design and research work that it basically so far exists only in the digital realm. So bear with me while I go through these. Okay. So Poppy Red is a project that truly began as a writing project that was interested in testing the capacities of massing strategies that resulted from forces of compression. And it was also interested in testing graphic conditions that alter the legibility of an underlying form. So a different kind of tension between these two things. And the project sort of like starts to travel non-linearly through many different kind of software packages and digital platforms, but it also takes cues very truthfully from physical artifacts. So, so these studies here show an attempt to wrap the 3D form with 2D line drawings that we saw in the previous slide where we had the two separated. And again, in much of my work, you'll see this kind of interest in studying raster conditions of vector-based data. So another kind of contentious relationship between raster and vector. So the object of destruction, as I like to call it in this project, it's neither the graphic nor its form, but rather the event. So the event that kind of drives one against the other, that maybe collapses the 3D form against the 2D graphic plane, or the other way around. And here's that selection again. So some of the physical artifacts here, they're based on hydro dipping, on flatbed printing, vinyl mapping, back painting, vacuum forming on rigid materials, and this kind of constant back and forth struggle between 2D and 3D data and how to collapse the two. But essentially the matrix shown here tests this kind of like forceful encounter between 2D graphic surface and 3D form and offers qualities that can hopefully advance our exploration in the confrontation of painterly effects and architectural volumes. So again, in looking for deviations from order, slippages between 2D and 3D information, I became most interested in this kind of hydro dipping technique since its literal, like fluid nature challenges the faceted geometry that supports that graphic. So I turned to digital simulation tools again in an attempt to kind of co-opt the behavior of water transfer printing from the physical studies. So a critical point to take note of is also the goal is not to precisely imitate the natural behavior, but to turn to the architecture proposal from earlier. Here we're attempting to kind of capitalize on an event that is equal parts fake and equal parts real, without favoring one or the other. And also we're looking to turn to processes guided by a phenomenology of empathy. So these simulations here sort of selectively replace and replicate some of the water transfer behaviors through varying kind of input parameters in the digital. And here we see another two material process studies side by side. So again, in the process, we're not aiming for this kind of like smooth, articulated, kind of like nice image, so to speak. We're interested much more in kind of testing the limits or the boundaries or how far you can push these kinds of contentious relationships between graphics and forms. And here using image sequences again, so going back to the kind of like the animation process, at some point I then select one of the frames in the sequence and then I start to kind of like panelize it and sort of work through the graphic results from the water transfer event. And we kind of start to see how these kind of like panelized systems start to choreograph together to create or recreate the form and the graphics. So now we start to also kind of understand the graphic and the geometric system through more conventional methods, such as panelized systems that assemble together to create some form. And here we see some detailed views. This is one of the large scale models of Poppy Red, one where the graphic intentionally kind of like misses its geometric edge and it starts to kind of create different sort of like figures depending on where you're looking for. So for example, like the white kind of solid figures that are created here and some of these edges of some of the line drawings here. And in theory, we're supposed to maybe see some of these. I don't know if you can see more. Yeah, you can. We're supposed to see some of these edges that are actually truer to the geometric form. And it's also important to note that this physical model, again, it is just one possible instantiation from the process. So other frames from the sequence could have easily been selected for further development. But again, here we see other misalignments and sometimes what I like to call misbehaving lines. Again, they're resultant from the kind of stretching and wrapping of the graphic once the volume is sort of pushed through it. Okay. And here's a couple of shots from an exhibition at the Pincoma Gallery in Boston back in 2019 when we used to have galleries in person. Hopefully soon again too. But in any case, for this installation, I staged a series of animations and simulations. Again, kind of like focusing on this kind of relationship between the event between 2D and 3D information. And here you can see that it was also important to kind of show how I use matrices and process and digital and physical tools and study models and variations in order to derive to a kind of project. And okay. So to admit to it beforehand, Poppy Red is one of these projects that's sort of, for me in my work, it kind of keeps on giving. Or another way to put it is that these projects are actually quite intertwined with one another. And it almost feels a little bit kind of like silly to delineate them between project 1, 2, or Poppy Red and Blue Red, I don't know, whatever. But they're linked and they're also, in my view, considered to be works in progress. So they're still not finalized, they're just kind of like progress ideas. So here I'm taking the same 2D drawing information from Poppy Red, altering the colors a little bit, and I'm trying to push this, this print fakely into the digital even further. So here we see a matrix of some of the extracted frames from the animation sequence of the simulation event. Again, we're looking at a kind of like loose imitation of the forces at play. So we're not interested in technological novelty and replicating the real with high precision by any means. So here's a top view of that same simulation. Again, it's really important because I'm definitely interested in kind of restricting the process to occupy mainly one Cartesian direction, right? So I'm keeping everything in this design experimentation phase in the Z-axis alone. So the extracted frames here, they're helpful, I hope, in seeing the progression of the simulation and the forces that kind of generate these alternative aesthetic experiences. And here we see the top view of what I'm calling a house 1 from a 3-house series. So my hope is that the matrix on the previous slide is not merely a diagram for explaining the process. I'm hoping that the matrix is a method of generating, but also perceiving the work, right? So this is because like one sees the matrix and when they see the matrix and they see the event in the matrix, hopefully we can capitalize on the kind of creative power of the simulation such that it belongs to the process wholeheartedly. And here we're zooming in further on the image to look at some of the kind of fine lines and some of the details in this process. And perhaps most importantly, looking at it in elevation. And I say most importantly because although I'm dedicated to the Z-axis in this process, it's actually the elevation, the moment where this sort of like vulnerability of the designer and the process is expressed. So the elevation starts to behave in its own kind of erratic way. And because of that kind of restrictive process of just operating in the Z-axis, I have no choice but to accept this elevation as an output as it is, with all of its fissures and misalignments and other kind of distraught characteristics. And in a closer view here, we can actually start to notice more overtly how the red lines are no longer lines, but they've become these like linear kind of color fields. And then the white lines, though not exactly tectonic in this example here, we'll see some of those as well. They're also at moments taking on that same sort of like rasterized language. So they still exist in a weird kind of undefined zone. And with that, I'm going to jump to another instantiation, which is house 2, also an elevation. And we're zooming in also so that we can see some of these vector raster blurs that are starting to occur, in particular, the sort of like the yellow one over here, for instance. So in house 2, there's also logic of the interior organization that responds to some of the material definitions of the exterior shell layer. So similarly to House 1 and to Poppy Red, House 2 also begins with a 2D drawing and a 3D volumetric cluster. The graphic stretch in House 2, though it's not as extreme as in House 1, it does actually still involve additional production processes and material definitions that are much more fragmented than what we saw in House 1. So the architectural articulation of the design process becomes much more complex in this project. So in this production animation sequence here, okay, we can start to see how these two primary drivers of the work start to converge. And I think what is also really interesting here is to see the kind of slippages between intentionality and chance. So there are aspects of the work that are very much intentional and they're very present in the process, but in that process, there's also aspects that simply arise and that they just could not have been accounted for. So this is an important part of the project to capitalize on. It's again a type of vulnerability to the work. So here we see the kind of the constructs focus on the fragmentation aspect of the material articulation. I'd like to believe that this fragmentation sort of like further celebrates that collapse between the 2D and the 3D. But again, like this is in terms of like localized and global conditions. So in here, we're starting to see a kind of like separation between some of the localized areas and some of the more global areas, as for example, these pink lines kind of stretch to the ground, they wrap up to the side over here, to the roof over here, and sort of continue to this chunk of the main volumetric house over here. Okay, and here we can see more clearly the kind of fragmentation of the cladding system directly responding to different graphic conditions of that, again, that 3D form pushed through 2D plane. The cladding changes materially, it changes visually, it changes tectonically, and it very much depends on the density of the lines that resulted from that kind of 3D, 2D operation. And then also the structural articulation too, perhaps the most visible of the elements in the project, it responds and reacts to the line drawing boundaries rather than the edges of the 3D geometry. So the yellow structure here, it's much more invested in the original 2D drawing than it is in the edges of the actual geometry that make up the house. Okay. And then the left diagram here, for example, shows sort of like 5 different cladding systems. So again, the kind of architectural articulation becomes much more overt, much more heavily invested in this project. So I imagine these layers sort of having different kinds of opaque panels, panels with milled lines on them, printed lines on them, semi-transparent glass, transparent glass, hues like pink and yellow hues, flat bed printed, and then ultimately the yellow steel structure, which we see very lightly at the very bottom on the left. Okay. And then in section, I kind of attempt to carry through this idea of nesting or kind of like nested forms. So organizationally, the interior program has been sprinkled throughout the space in response to the transparencies that are afforded by the cladding systems and the graphic boundaries. So there is like a kind of relationship between like program and transparencies. And here in the zoomed in section as well, you can maybe start to notice the alignment of the structural system with the panelization system. So the subdivision of the panels, however, it starts to kind of refuse to correspond to the underlying geometry. And again, their allegiance belongs more closely to the graphic blanket, to that 2D drawing that is part of the process since the very beginning. And these subdivisions, again, produce different kinds of figural and pictorial moments. And these kinds of like figural and pictorial moments, they also depend on the observer's position in space. All right, so I'll just let this animation play out for a minute again to just highlight the idea of process and the conflation at a time that sort of like certain things are being rejected in the 2D and certain things are being renegotiated in 3D with this question of like the tectonic and the pictorial in mind. I should just loop that. I don't know if there's like a lag, sorry. And again, if the animation was playing, I wanted to point once more to that sort of, to that strange kind of like liminal zone between that Z direction that is quite overpowering and the corresponding elevational qualities that are simply resultant. And here we have house 3. And again, also deriving from that puppy red experimentation that I started with this last unit in the house series, I continued to test the viability of my process at the scale of a building. So the project proposes a house, which is clad in flatbed printed glazed panels, which is a graphic production process that I've actually been working with for quite a while. It's by definition a kind of prolific consumerist production method. So in co-opting it, I'm still kind of wondering and questioning what the implications of that are, as I am kind of like definitely misusing this otherwise perfect production methodology. But in misusing it, I'm also wondering, am I continuously reinforcing it, and is that okay? And what are some of the implications of grappling with these kinds of image-centric kind of production processes? Okay, and here we see a first look at the interior. So when we're looking at the second level, which again takes its cues from the vertical circulation, but also the overall kind of footprint of the massing. And again, keeping in mind that this massing originated from sort of like crushing rectilinear forms into one another. And organizationally, the house exhibits kind of like that particulate compositional qualities. We can see that in the sort of like programmatic resolve, but we can also see it in the sort of like nesting and peeling characteristics of the interior enclosures. For example, over here, over here, over here, and some of these kind of fragmented conditions between interior and exterior. Okay, and then embedded in the graphic blanket, there's also these kinds of like residual pink lines, which I then use as center lines for the structure, for the primary structural system. So on the diagram on the right, we can sort of see the composite layers of lines and tectonics. So at the top, we have the sort of the green graphic lines that are just simply printed. In the middle, we have the kind of the pink lines, which then get generated into the primary structural members. And at the bottom, we see the 3D transformation of that middle layer. So these assembly diagrams show how complex formal and graphical exercises are domesticated to fit plausible construction processes. And you can see the sort of the interior assembly of parts on the left diagram and the exterior assembly of parts on the right diagram. All right, so with that, excuse me, this next set of drawings, 3 in total, are derived from house 3. So one of the things that I hope is evident throughout this talk is that lines arranged in space are a really important part of my practice. I've been very curious, borderline, I want to say maybe obsessed, since I started to study architecture actually. So I came to architecture from a math and science training, and the only drawing that I had produced, or the only type of drawing that I had produced until then, were molecular compound diagrams for chemistry and geometry diagrams for mathematical proofs. So during our first representation class, I think like first year undergrad or something, we were still drafting at the time. So we had a representation instructor who brought in a pepper that was cut in half and told us that we were going to represent the thickness of the pepper with 2 thin lines. And this was an incredibly simple, but so abstract and so profound of a moment for me and my kind of like introduction to architectural drawing. And I think it was this very moment that kind of like led to a rigorous investigation in drawing as a way to understand, but to also reciprocate with architecture. Okay, so back to the drawing, this first one here. We are seeing house 3 that I just showed. It's a 3D view, as a line drawing. It's a collection of all the vector data that was involved in kind of like processing and sort of developing and designing the house. So in a way, the vector data here is used as a kind of geometric truth. But in this next one here, we start to see multiple layers of information. So the geometrical truths, they're still in there, but also we're starting to see layers of data that pertain to the production of the geometries of the house. So we start to see actual annotative data, points in space, tiny coordinate Cartesian planes, over here, and over here that are overlapping. And we see registration points for production processes and more. So then on this next top view drawing, we're also seeing traces of lines or toolpaths rather that register the motions of computer controlled numerical processes. But in this example, we start to actually lose the massing entirely that we could actually see in the previous two drawings. But it doesn't make it any less of a truthful of a drawing as the previous two. So again, like these drawings seem kind of abstract, but to me, they're essentially more real than anything else in my practice. All right, so with that, if you'll allow me one more sidebar into the realm of drawing as motion, or rather as registration of motion, I want to go back all the way to antiquity with Aristotle's investigations of mechanical motion and the need to diagram these motions in order to understand how they operated. So in addition to the practice of drawing, there's also a very important moment here. It's a lyrical component. And note that the way that Aristotle asks these questions are such as, I quote from the book, why does a balance beam return when you remove the weight if the string is set from the top, and not return but stay put when supported from below? Is it because when the string is set above, more of the balance is on the far side of the vertical? Keeping in mind here, end quote, and keeping in mind here that gravity was not discovered for another 2 millennia. So I'll return to this question of the lyrical again, and how the lyrical and these highly kind of geometric truth diagrams can sort of kind of play hand in hand. So then in his 1948 book, Mechanization Takes Command, I know this is like overly referenced, but I'm going to return to it for just a brief moment. Historian and architecture critic Sigrid Gideon places a jump in production side by side. So he talks about this production of single products by hand to production of standardized parts. So he argued that something really important started to take place in this transition from handmade to machine made, or if I can describe it in other words, we're talking about the relationship between, so on the one hand, you have people and the objects or materials that they're producing, and then you have this new relationship that transitioned from a one-to-one between producer and product. So here I am making this product, to producer who produces parts that make a machine, that make a product. So the assembly line, for example, was a primary protagonist in this transformation, or rather the kind of the structure that describes this phenomena the best, I would say. But also the problem is that it adds, this kind of transition adds an enormous degree of separation from motion or hand motion or kind of hand movement to product. So a separation that the kind of the yellow drawing series that I just showed, in a way they tried to attempt to bridge. And with the rise of industrialization, here we have Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who became two very important figures in this kind of newfound resource all of a sudden, efficiency and productivity, and they set out to kind of determine the laws of efficiency in that sense, which then gave way to a new school of thought, which was management consulting, and later was referred to scientific management. But what was interesting is that the Gilbreths started to record the hand motions of laborers by placing little light attachments to workers' hands so that they could video record the hand movement of the laborers as they engaged in assembly line type of work. So now we enter the realm of diagramming motion, which is kind of a form of representation of labor practice. So somewhere between the scientific and the mechanical hand, the artistic hand, they came up with this idea of the Chrono Cyclograph, which became a study of truth in my opinion, but also became a mode of drawing in 3D space. So in the drawings here, the figure starts to kind of fade, and all we're left with is traces of the real. So thinking back here to that third drawing in the yellow series, where the massing of the architecture actually had faded suddenly, and all we were left with were the things that would have taken place in order to make it. And then jumping forward quite a few decades. Then we had the punch card system, and then we had the CNC system, which essentially is coordinate data, which records positions in 3D space for some kind of production methodology. And again, I like to put these kinds of images side by side as two layers of information that are telling the same truth, but are visually so far apart from one another. So with this kind of framework in mind, I'm not going to show another a brief series of drawings that operate on kind of traces of motion as geometric truths, but also that offer a different kind of aesthetic experience. So here's one example. So somewhere here, we're looking between line drawing and painted surface. I refer to these production instantiations as objects rather than drawings. So the drawings themselves, they offer the visual effect of motion. So they trace movement from the picture support to the picture plane. So the picture support, we're referring to it here, and this is the picture plane, kind of reversal. And in a way, I like to believe that this kind of trace spatializes a line drawing so that it's removed from the kind of like flat like picture plane, and it starts to kind of bleed into 3D space. And again, so this is another example. So that kind of like topmost layer of these objects, it almost always is a white linear one, and the white lines as a kind of cluster, as a composition, they try to create an illusion of depth while also maintaining a kind of 3D sort of sculptural effect. And again, like the drawings are very static in nature, but the idea or the hope is that the appearance of motion is still present in the drawing plane, even though this isn't a kind of associated object, it's a physical object in our space. So here we have planar line clusters again, describing traces of motion as they flow from one direction to the next. Although the clusters of lines like bend and they change direction, sometimes they kind of like overlap, they always maintain a sense of continuity. So the lines actually, they only terminate at the boundary of the drawing or the boundary of the support. There's no endpoint in the actual composition. And with this example here, I'm trying to kind of enter yet another realm. I'm trying to spatialize the line even further by negotiating kind of less expected play between line, depth, and space. So in this example, the picture plane is slightly displaced and it's decoupled from its host, from its support. So there's another kind of level of disorientation. And again, in addition, this combination of sort of in here we have white lines, we have white translucent lines. You can't discern from them because they're overlapping, but they produce this kind of like different kind of tectonic lines. So some are milled, some are painted, some are printed. They produce a different kind of effect, a kind of architecturally specific drawing that I hope sort of expands into the field of spatial illusion. And here again, we're looking at that tectonic dimension with this method of production. So again, we're looking here at printing in jet ink, cured by UV light, which directly is printed onto translucent surfaces. But now we're also starting to see the addition of light as an installation technique that can activate these line clusters in different ways. So here we're going to get a little bit more into the kind of the tectonic condition of these works. So again, this exploration sort of like began with a question of architectural production. There's typically 5 layers of color fills, line traces, digital information in all of these drawings. But what's important that you can see here a little bit in the low relief is that each one plays an important role in the emergence of figure. We're looking at negative voids, we're looking at misalignments and misregistrations, and other kinds of graphic effects. So again, so my curiosities with the series lie somewhere in this kind of interchange between the physical and the optical consequences of this question of the tectonic of the line. How does it emerge from the digital process, and how these workflows start to enter our actual real space. So this brief snapshot here, it shows like several primary states that the line passes through. Again, this is during the production of this drawing. So it's printing process on a rigid material, and the lines and the color no longer belong to that kind of flatbed image. They're now integrated into the properties of the acrylic, the bumpiness of the acrylic, the UV, the curing of the UV, and so on. So this diagram here shows the layer structure of this particular drawing. So again, the breakdown shows the structural logics of the assembly of the linear and the chromatic. So the very first printed layer to the far right, over here, it's a solid white fill that kind of functions as a mask to hide and reveal two different states of material transparency, the solid and the void. And this is a kind of like first act of the drawing. Then the rest of the layers are then sequentially built on top of one another until the final figure emerges. And again, establishing a kind of clear route from the virtual to the material. So what's interesting, though, is that the aesthetic objective of the scaffold, it kind of forges an intimate relationship between structure and form. So the white fill layer, now it's on the far left, sorry to switch it. And that is the first, so again, that's the first mark that creates the figure in the field. But then we have the second layer right after it over here. Which acts not just as a mask, but it starts to kind of conflate the figure and the ground by gently softening the edges over here of the explicit outline of the figure from the first layer over here. So in a way, we're also softening that binary of void and solid. Okay, so I wanted to give you that kind of whole hyper-focused analysis of the physical manifestations of these drawings to again expose the capacities of the line between beyond mere drawing and representation. And again, for me, these works, like they start to play with things like repetition, similarity, variance, low relief, tectonics. But again, we see the kind of like the entirety of the structure as an object and as a drawing and as a process and as a production, all kind of simultaneously embedded in this diagram here. All right, and I'm going to scale up for a minute and look at this one-to-one instantiation of this architectural drawing type as a visual phenomenon. So this is a privacy screen installation that I completed a few years ago. And in this diagram here, we can see the layer structure that creates the visual effects of the drawing. So in a way, this is simultaneously a design diagram and it's an installation instruction set as well. So here we see a small snippet of the installation. The drawing aspect is still very much a drawing, though I think this also kind of plays on that sort of like distance factor where different densities of lines produce different kinds of aesthetic effects depending on how far or how close you are to the drawing. So again, the various layers of opacity and translucency are assembled in such a way that the visual perception of positive and negative figures emerge and they alter depending, for example, here it depends on whether it's front lit, as we see in this image here, or the backlit condition as we see in this image here, or in other words, because it is a privacy screen, it kind of denotes whether or not the room is being occupied at the time. So compositionally, you can see that I'm here thinking of primitive and skewed geometries that are kind of suspended in midair, in a way resisting kind of gravitational pulls. So there is a sort of like a negative force. Again, this is in the Z direction, although it is elevational, but in our space, it's in the Z direction. And here's an animation, as it is common for me by now, to work in this medium. So the support for the graphic content of this project is the glazed wall. So there's planar color fills that kind of gracefully fall down to create this sort of like balanced composition in space. These color fills are then sort of like redrawn as a series of clusters of green lines. And then they're also drawn as clusters of white lines. And they're again re-represented or kind of rerun through the process as opaque fills. Here we see some of the green fills and some of the white fills that are actually, the white fills are actually installed on the other side of the glazed wall. So there's also kind of double-sidedness to this as well. So in other words, the project really like registers various positions of primitive geometries that are suspended strategically at particular areas, depending on privacy needs. So the line drawing component of the project is an exercise in graphics and the activation of such graphics through lighting. Therefore, the piece sort of reads differently when viewed from the inside, from the outside, when lights are on, when lights are off, and so on. Okay. As a continuation, actually maybe sometimes deviation from this research as well, I'm going to quickly show two projects they're both done in collaboration with my first co-fellow, Hans Tersak at University of Michigan. So this project here, titled Transfers, it's actually a sculpture project, and it's located in an art field called Art OMI in Ghent in New York. It's about a 3-hour drive from New York City. It's been up since 2018, and shockingly, it still looks exactly the same as it did when it was installed. And okay, so I'm going to play this one more time. So in the sequence here, we're starting to see a kind of orchestration of parts that are needed to kind of connect and sort of maintain and keep all the units in place in order to build the structure. Again, it's important to kind of note the use of animation sequence as a tool to think through the fabrication and production process. And also, it's important to take note of this kind of the separation of the graphic layer, which we see over here, as a geometric entity, even though it is simply a print layer. So the basic premise of the project is that the piece should read like a proto-architectural massing study. So in our conversations with the curator, so there's yet another kind of layer of agency in here, we decided that it should read like a sort of forced geometric cluster situated in the woods. So outside of the graphic, there's also kind of a primary source of inspiration for the project, which is also rooted in this kind of geometric acrobatic notion, I would say. So here we kind of see these volumetric clusters that are being projected or dragged through a 2.5D environment. So from a formal perspective, the aim of the project was to reconcile a crystalline faceted geometric massing study with the sort of like the line work and the 2D drawing and the kind of the illustrative component. But in the installation, the hope is that you can read the influence of mass and line simultaneously. And here we see a form generation diagram of the piece. On the second row of the drawing, you see a kind of carving operation of the outer volume. It's an attempt to kind of reveal an inner figure. And on the third row, you see a sequence of kind of compressive forces that are pushing in, and they begin to kind of crush the volume in on itself. Okay, so again, kind of showed you the solid sort of like masses in the introduction of the project, but when it actually comes down to like making the piece, the sculpture is made out of thin planes. So the project was actually sponsored by Korean Solid Surfaces Materials. So again, it was fabricated in these panels, which then sat on a 1/4-inch thick water jet aluminum structure. And then following some of the fellowship work that I showed earlier, so each panel of the piece is printed using a flatbed commercial sign printer. The piece was designed to be sort of like flat packed and shipped in a small van. So there's also a kind of yet another layer of agency in the project, which is the economic justification as well. And as designers in the current landscape, is something that we also have to take into great consideration. And again, we're seeing the piece under construction. So what's also really interesting is that we actually use a tolerance level of 1/32 of an inch in the fabrication and assembly of the piece. So there's no welding of any sort. Everything just kind of like interlocks into place. So again, the assembly logics take into consideration that we're going to construct the piece with very low-tech tools in the field with just 2 sets of hand on site. And this is something that's kind of consistent in these works as well. So here we also see some of the connection details where we see the aluminum water jet structure and how it meets the Korean panels. And we also thought it was important to actually express the hardware and show the connections between the parts and the different kinds of like material systems rather than try to hide it. So again, here we see the piece from the back. The ambition is that the piece should read as a kind of continuous shell from far away, but it should also read like an assembly or a kit of parts from up close. But in my opinion, I wanted to show this other kind of back view, which I think is one of the better views, because it actually starts to show how the graphic condition or the graphic map or the drawing sort of starts to skip the overall geometry of the form and kind of creates its own sort of like figure. And there's also like another theme in the work, which is again, like how this like graphic kind of condition starts to negotiate and collaborate with the three-dimensional support, or in other words, it's kind of, its underlying frame. So again, the conversation hopefully here is between like drawing, material assembly, and hopefully these kinds of convergences and conversations can motivate a person to sort of to view the piece in 360 in our actual space. And here's the last photo of that installation in the snow. So, which is kind of funny, and I wanted to put this one here, not for any particular reason, but we didn't originally anticipate the different seasons when we first designed the piece. But it was interesting to see it in such different settings throughout the year, and to also see how through this flatbed printing technique or printing production, it was interesting to see how the piece never weathered. So it remained like this like very strange kind of like digital artifact in the middle of like a very beautiful sort of natural scene, something that we're still kind of like sitting on. All right, so last project, I mean it. So this is also a collaboration. This was installed and exhibited in Columbus, Indiana. This is part of the biannual exhibition efforts of Exhibit Columbus. And this project sat in front of the Aristotle and First Christian Church. So here you can see some of the continuation, some of the earlier work, again, with a kind of geometry of the pavilion's massing. In this installation, it was also really important that, again, like this use of the light. We were also in the outdoors. So in this installation, like we were interested in how we can start to bring light in and how the structure would be sort of illuminated such that it renders the site as activated in all times of the day. So we're not just talking about seasons here. We're talking about like the different kinds of the day, different times of the day. So with this project, again, there's two primary sort of like conceptual drivers. First, the ambition was to imagine a kind of series of architectural forms as wireframes or kinds of like skeletal constructions. So again, thinking about like volumes emerging from lines composed in 3D space. And the second was how architecture might give shape to natural systems. In other words, how do we, in sort of like in popular culture, how do we start to like kind of exhibit natural history, ecological networks? So it was exciting to kind of to start here to consider a different kind of material attribute. And again, we're turning here to Jane Bennett's thoughts on the politics of materials and assemblages with this project. So the question of material and kind of displaying material is very different from what we typically think of as a material expression in architecture. So here we see that side by side on the left and right hand sides. Okay. And here's a form generation diagram again, not unlike the previous ones that we've seen. So here we see a different kind of sequence. This is a little bit more procedural and explanatory, and it is so because it directly relates to the fact that this was from beginning to end a construction project, something that had to be on site. And here's an early design representation model of the project. Again, I wanted to put this one here too, because I wanted to point to the material change from the original conception of clear panels to the actual finalized built one, which had white opaque panels. So simply put, this change, it was funding specific. So again, bringing in the kind of the different kinds of agencies and layers of agencies that that are important in a design project. But other than that, also the representation model is kind of like one-off in my practice because this was used specifically for the design symposium. So there is a sort of like a friction between using just like a physical model strictly as representation rather than a physical model as something that actually guides the design process. All right, so here, the kind of basic material idea for the pavilion is that it kind of like co-opts like ready-made assembly logics. So it's a combination of off-the-shelf part components and machine precision fabricated parts. You can see kind of like all the parts in here in this like completely impossible to understand diagram, which is also really important. And then here, as you start to zoom in, you can kind of see, you can actually see the 5 parts of the assembly. So from the left, you see the earth anchors that ground the entire pavilion. Then you see the custom connections from panel to panel. Then you see the bent tubes in the second diagram for the left and the straight cut tubes in the third diagram. And then lastly, you see the subdivided panels on the very right. And here's a close-up of that diagram. Okay, so the pavilion was based on two relatively simple decisions that made the fabrication and construction phases possible at all. So the first one was that the decision to unify all the unique radii from, as we can see on the left, what seemed to be an infinite amount of radii. And then so that we could, by unifying them, that we can actually see in situ bend all the elbows so that we can make all the panels. The second decision, or rather discovery, was to kind of offload all the custom angles in 2D planar cutting fabrication, which is a much lighter endeavor to 2D cut something than 3D carve something. So offloading that to the 2D. And then all the connections, as you can see here, are made from these water jet aluminum plates, which are then connected to these custom-made parts, which then hold the tube frame of the different panels together. So again, here we're focusing on that kind of desire to land somewhere between standardized production and 100% custom fabrication. So we literally like designed the pavilion down to the nut and bolt and even the pigment, as you can see here. So these are some of the shots from the Autodesk Technology Center in Boston. So here primarily we're showing 144 of these connection parts, which were milled out of solid aluminum blocks. And these parts negotiated the 4-directional moment at every frame-to-frame connection. So again, mass producing 144 identical parts essentially take the same amount of intelligent labor as fabricating just one unique one, because the other 143 parts were actually primarily machine labor. So here we are on site assembling the pavilion. It was just about 2 weeks with 4 of us. So it was just me, my collaborator, and 2 of our research assistants. So there's a kind of, there's also another layer of kind of the kit of parts embedded in that, in the composition of the structure. Here we can kind of see that the level of detail also extended to the display tables and to the information stands. And again, from a formal perspective, the pavilion again starts to ask whether or not an architectural structure, that kind of original idea that I was talking about, a wireframe, how can it be expressive? How can lines formed in 3D space express architectural volume? There's also this idea of sort of like a form as a diagram of forces. So in here, looking more closely to the elevation, we're actually confronted with fragmented panels composed on this kind of almost a vertical plane, although it starts to kind of like wobble and move in that 2.5D thickness, as I like to call it. And here's a view from the interior. So the question of enclosure was yet another important issue in this iteration, because we started to consider the ground plane as a site of casual encounter. This encounter is between human and non-human subjects. So again, we're thinking of a different kind of material articulation here. So we're thinking of the scale of the pavilion, again, is actually determined not by its proximity to the human scale. A human is actually about this tall over here, but it's actually determined by how it sits in the site, which is under the canopy of the trees. And here are some of the connection details that again negotiate the different angles and the different directions of the structures and panels. And here's another overall view. And you can see that the pavilion truly sits on that understory of the existing kind of tree landscape. So again, I presented the kind of extent of the digital fabrication and research work in relationship to the scale of this project. But truly the ambition of the pavilion is to kind of pose it as a model that is potentially scalable into our actual space. And I'll play this video out. I think it's going to play for a little bit, but I wanted to sort of conclude and reiterate that the ambition of the project is, again, to display this relationship between multiple elements, such as planar arrangements, wireframes, linear expressions, formal articulation, surface conditions, even in the white opaque panels. And it's in an attempt to propose this as a kind of viable architectural solution. So I'm ending the visual lecture with this video of the pavilion and some kind of like verbal concluding notes, because I want to kind of return one final time and expand on discussion of perceptual mechanisms by ways of, again, once more, my favorite philosopher to read currently, Jane Bennett, who I've brought up multiple times in this presentation. But so Bennett, she describes this concept that she refers to as lyrical force, and I wanted to sort of like circle back to that for a minute because I want to leave everyone with it. So she tells us that when a viewing subject encounters a thing that has lyrical force, they can be overcome with extraordinary fascination. So we, as agents that see and create, and I talk about us as architectural agents, in creating, we're also encountering the thing that we are creating, regardless of its position, stage, or whether it's in the digital or the real. She further adds that our human perception is structured to look for these extraordinary moments, even though we have been, in the more recent times, trained to look for more structured conditions. So almost kind of circling back here to that sort of, to the violence of the imposition of order and structure that we're kind of trained and forced into. But Bennett, however, is hoping that we can begin to turn to more haptic, visual, and lyrical influences from our surroundings, rather than simply depend on our cognitive behavior, which is much more trained. So here is to hoping that we are more susceptible to outside influences, to imminent elements in a dilapidated church, for example, because we as creative human authors and architects, according to Bennett, are ultimately beings that create relationships with other beings and other things, human and non-human, equally and simultaneously. And I'm going to end it at that. Thank you. Let me put this in again. Okay. Should I grab this? Okay. Okay. It's not locked. I think this is still on, yes? It's green. Okay.
And Danny, do I need to turn on my microphone here? That's it.
This is super high tech. I like it.
Thank you so much, Viola, for joining us today, sharing your work with us. I really responded when you talked about the meshing.
Mhm.
And which philosopher was it that said that both the observer and the author are participating in an act of creation when viewing or in the creation of a piece of art?
Yeah, Tim Ingold, the enmeshing mechanism. Yeah.
So it made me think about my own response to your work.
Mhm.
And so what I'm going to be coming to is a question about the generation of form.
Mhm.
So one of the things my reactions to your work is I can so clearly see that it's authored.
Mhm.
And I see I see a series of actions, micro actions upon materials, much different than sort of the response I have to mass-produced
Mhm.
objects who have the author erased from it, essentially,
Mhm.
through the modes of production. So when I'm looking at your work, because I'm an architect, I tried to deconstruct it. I tried to work backwards. I'm like, oh, I was thinking of the piece in the park with the
Mhm.
green, and so maybe this happened, and then I get back to the moment where I'm like, where did she begin? What is that first initial form?
Uh-huh.
When we get to see the poppy piece and the other pieces, where you're already showing them to us at a fairly high level of complexity. So do you start with a primitive? Do you what are some of the methods you use to begin?
Yeah, that is a really fantastic question. And I think it's such an important question to kind of start the conversation, because I think you're really pointing to the kind of genesis of my practice. I started my research project when I started teaching. So actually, the point of the kind of point of departure for a project, it's very much related to how I build kind of design exercises in the studio, for example. Almost everything, I think, like, I don't want to lie, but I'm pretty sure that everything that I show today starts from a rectangular prism, which is just a baseline geometric structure. And the idea here is that it's not necessarily essential to start with with complex items or things that have already meaning or have been stylized and so on. So when I started to think about the use of a kind of a singular primitive geometry, I thought about this as being just as good as any other kind of any other tool, unit, aspect, whatever you want to call it, to begin an architecture project with. So I relate this back to kind of like my how I started to learn how to teach in a way too, because my pedagogical approach and my research project were sort of like growing in tandem with one another. And again, like the question that I was grappling with was this, the basis of a kind of a design studio, for example. Who's to say that it should be based on something that is a little bit more geometrical or rooted in the kind of trajectory of like the Western canon and so on? Or does it come from historical precedents? Does it come, so this was the kind of conversation that was very apparent at the time when I started to teach. So for me, it was, we're going to start with a rectangular prism, and we're going to then work through like different kinds of apparatuses and so on to generate form, but we're starting with a rectangular prism as a baseline. So that sort of renders everyone almost as like equal kind of agents in the production of a collective endeavor, where everyone is starting with the kind of like the same thing. But what I also want to highlight, and this is extremely important in my work, is that, and maybe this is a reaction to when I started to, maybe my training in architecture or something like this, but I am very interested in the authorial hand, in being very present in the work, but simultaneously allowing the process to gain its own language, to develop its own language, and in a way, the process to force you to become a part of it as well. So it's not necessarily that me as an author, I'm the authoritative force and I make all the decisions. I make some decisions. I look at the reaction of the decisions, and then that informs me to make some other choices. But at the same time, I am allowing some of the vulnerabilities of that process to kind of engage with the work so that it develops another language. And at a certain point, I would argue that some of this work becomes like a different kind of conversation. Like at some moment, I can no longer talk to my work because it's already grown in its own way, and it's developed its own kind of vocabulary that is not my vocabulary, because it's not a human vocabulary. It resists a kind of like verbal condition, and it takes on this whole other experiential sort of plane. So, but I relate that to maybe like my moment in training as an architect, where this question of like author and how much of the author is removed, and like digital processes are kind of removing the author because they're becoming, these were all very real and very heavy questions. But for me, I don't think that the removal of the author is something that needs to be sort of established hierarchically. I think it's something that can emerge out of a deeply enmeshing kind of process between, me as presenting this lecture, you as sort of like receiving the lecture, and so on. So it kind of like expands into like other kinds of formats too, which is another conversation, but it's also interesting in its own.
So in terms of the authorship of the individual specific moves that generate the work, I heard you speak a bit of working almost like intuitively or impulsively, not in any kind of bad connotation of those words, but then also the introduction of things like turbulence. Now, are you using digital processes? Where does the kind of impulse, the mark of the author, and then end, and then the digital process take over?
Is this being recorded? Because I need to write this down later. That's also really good. That's also it's another fantastic question, because it is, and yes, impulse is absolutely the correct term to use for it. And another thing that I'd like to point to is that me working in this process now versus me working in this process 2 years ago or 2 years from now is actually going to be quite different, because my frame of reference has changed. So I encourage my students, I encourage myself to give into impulses, because we're constantly influenced by our surrounding. And this kind of like giving into impulses, giving into that kind of like intuitive condition will allow other things that we've been told maybe that shouldn't be allowed in the design process to kind of enter that design process and ultimately make it much more corresponding to you as an author. So I think, I don't know if this is like a sort of a stance against the kind of like high modernist tradition of, you know, rigid this and order that and so on. But I do think that there is enormous potential in allowing all these things that we've kind of deemed as negative, or, you know, we have to say things like, well, I mean it in a good way. And it's like, no, we can mean it in a bad way too. And I think that it is really important to bring in all these external things and allow them to be part of that design process.
Let me just see if this is. I'll ask one more question and then I'll move to the Q&A. So a lot of the philosophy behind your work comes from a critique of modernism in the sense of these authoritarian ordering systems, right? You know, I'm imagining such a sort of proportion, and you mentioned nesting and things like that. So, and yet, and you even mentioned this in your talk, the sort of, you must have some kind of ambivalence then to be so critical of modernism, and then yet be using representational methods of modernism to produce and exhibit the work, such as the orthographic drawing, right, and the isometric drawing.
Yep.
Do you have any more thoughts about sort of how to sit in that ambiguous place?
I don't know if I have thoughts on it, but it is something that I think will be a continuous struggle for my work and a continuous question. And I think that's okay. And maybe it's productive, maybe it's not. It doesn't matter. But the question that I think you're also hitting in this question of like, in an attempt to escape something, sometimes we end up reinforcing it even more. And this is something that I think like peeks and like here and there into my work. And again, like, but I think maybe I'm not necessarily setting out to resist or reject everything there is about like these like previous kind of like the things that we've inherited from previous canonical moments in architecture. Instead, I'm in a way more interested in figuring out what they missed and bringing that into our current moment. And it's not it's not just like, oh, you know, I want to find something else because like what's next in architecture. I sincerely think that this comes out from a desire that wants the field to be more pluralistic, that it is not necessarily rooted in a kind of trajectory, in a kind of, in a trajectory that has to be vetted by the kind of overseeing powers of architecture. Like who's to say what work should be deemed as this or that? So in a way, I guess I'm also interested in removing that kind of evaluative criteria we were so used to. And in that, I'm hoping that different kinds of architectural practices will emerge. And I'm not saying that this is like something that will be indefinitely forever and ever, but maybe at this moment right now, I just think we're so badly stuck that I think this kind of pluralistic condition, it will also expand our field too, so that it's not so insular, so that we can respond to things like violence in the body and violence in the psyche, and how we can express that into our work as well, even though it's, you know, things that are not necessarily verbally communicated. I don't know if that's, so I think like what I'm trying to say is that like I'm not here with like a pitchfork against modernism. I mean, in a way, yes. But I am more interested in sort of seeing the parts that were missed and other potentialities. Yeah, that right. Sure.
All right, we have some very specific questions.
Oh,
this is from Stephen Mueller.
Hi, Stephen. I don't know if you can see me.
Thank you, Viola. So inspiring. I'm curious, as we are often working with students on developing correspondences and productive misalignments between structural systems and environmental enclosures, envelopes, and membranes, if the loose fit between volume and surface conditions in your experimental work endeavors to translate to any ideas of performance or use or program. For example, for you, does the blurred condition between volume and surface generate new, potentially indeterminate forms of encounter, environment, or politics?
Yeah, so this is another really important part of the work that I'm still sort of like trying to work through, in the sense that, so I talk about like enclosures and I talk about these kinds of like structural systems, but I'm not talking about them, and this is, again, like maybe Stephen can help me figure this out too, but the questions, so like at this moment, I'm asking these questions in terms of like kind of design experimentation phase, and how we can allow these kinds of like indeterminisms and instabilities to enter the design process. But in terms of to what end, I'm not sure where the implications lie in that process, because I don't know that I have, in a way, like I think I would have to kind of like reverse engineer that in order to determine to what end part, right? So I think that maybe with that question in mind, then the processes that I'm proposing are a little bit more general, and they're not necessarily pointing to like more specific kind of instantiations of work that produces something else. So because I wonder about this thing where it's, you know, things like the pavilion, for example, which was an enormous feat. I think there were like 6 different funding sources for that project, actually 7, I think. It involved like 3 different institutions, 2 different schools, you know. And again, the question is, you know, it's a design experimentation. It's something that is active and actant in the real world. But the question is, again, like, what did it produce, and how can we, is this knowledge transferable, right? So I'm not sure to answer Stephen's question, but I'm okay in the not being sure, because I think these things take a really long time in order for change to truly emerge and to stay. So I think I'm sort of comfortably sitting in that moment where instabilities and destabilizations and turbulences and slippages between like volume and wireframe are just that and nothing else. Maybe that's a shortcoming to the work. I don't know. I would have to think about it, but I think for the moment, I think it's okay.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really fantastic question. And if we didn't, if all of the labs hadn't closed down over the last 2 years, I would have had a lot more to show on that. The very first pavilion that I showed that kind of adds that turbulence factor, that pavilion was meant to be built as a kind of structure that if you pushed on it, it would actually sort of like fall apart almost. It would kind of like operate in the same way as some of the forces that originally kind of generated the pavilion. So it's really, I love Barry LeVay's work. I think like one of the sculptures, I'm going to call it because that's what he called it, that I'm fascinated with is the one where he runs into the wall 56 times or whatever it is, I don't remember. And the sculpture is then after just the traces of like sweat and blood on the wall from him running into it, and the sound recording. So everything that makes the sculpture is there, but the sculpture itself, but the sculpture is the thing that makes it in a way. So, and that is very much where I look to with these kinds of these like machine drawings, the yellow sequence, right? The yellow drawing sequence. Where I'm interested in kind of reading everything that makes the work, but not necessarily the work within it, because then we're talking about a different kind of politics, I think. So, but that is the moment where I'm in right now, which is how does that activate our space, the space that we occupy as humans too. And that's something that I just need to kind of work with and test. And I really like the reading that you had of the drone footage where it looked like we were drawing the pavilion on site by way of motion and bodies occupying space. But I think it's interesting because I keep talking about the body being in correspondence with the digital environment, for example, because that's what I've been working on for the last 2 years, as I'm sure a lot of us have. And it's in a way kind of backwards to think about the body as being more enmeshed in the digital environment than the physical environment. But at the same time, like it's also like a very interesting and intriguing and also impossible condition to think about the body as being enmeshed in a digital environment, because we don't yet understand how that works. But I think it is through this question of forces, motions, kind of aesthetic, but also empathetic experience and foreign experiences that I think we can start to conflate the digital and the real. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. 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 No, it's, I think those kinds of like the edits, for example, I think they are part of that kind of corresponding process, that kind of like a meshing process that is all part of the same sort of, it's not necessarily a lineage, it's just a kind of complex network of small informations being kind of perceived and received as you operate in a kind of creative process. And I think that's where some of like most of my work comes from. Yeah, the implications of the real, the kind of like the material thing on site is, it's a big part of it. It's not the primary part, but it's something that hopefully with some of the lifting of the moving forward with the COVID conditions and labs opening and things like that, I'm hoping that some more work will emerge from it. Thank you.
I've never done this before moderating. I have a lot of questions. Do I lock the doors and do we answer them all? Do I get to pick? How does this work, Jeff? Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about site-specific type of work. And we have a question for this. I think this is like some clarity on something. This is from Javier de Anda. An Albanian theater was mentioned to be illegally destroyed to place a new bow tie shaped one in its place. And then you followed by saying that the construction of the new theater denies the history of the previous theater. My question is, what history is it denying? And can you speak of how or if this type of thing drives your design in any way?
Okay. So this is quite
there's a shift.
Well, it has a very long answer associated to it. So site specificity is it's a tricky kind of slippery slope too, in a way. So I'm not necessarily proposing that like I'm not even arguing that, like, the old theater shouldn't have been demolished, shouldn't have been demolished legally, but it shouldn't have been demolished, but either way. So let's take for example, the scenario as it is. It was demolished, whether illegally or not, whatever. And that's just how it is. We have a flat site. The site itself, even though there are no material remains of the previous theater, there are layers of history that are implicated on that site because it had been used for 80 years by different groups of people and so on. That historical theater beforehand was actually a colonizer building because it was built in the Italian rationalist style during the colonization of Albania under Mussolini. So it's this like strange kind of condition where, like, why would you want to revive or kind of like hold on to some of that history? So I'm not arguing that, like, we take everything and we sort of, like, again, like, to evaluate it as good or bad. Like, that's not what I'm hoping for. But what I'm hoping for is that there is a moment or a space where these kinds of immaterial events or the immaterial conditions of having a historical building that had cultivated many people over decades, that somehow be present in the design process. And to me, not that I know what B.Arch Engels' design process was, but to me, a kind of standalone, one instance bow tie shaped theater rendered in steel and glass very much denies any possibility or any opportunity to acknowledge the complexity of the history that existed on the site. And again, like, in terms of like the specificity component of it, it doesn't have to be specifically that parts of that theater are replicated or anything like that. Like, I'm not talking about a kind of like, like, I'll leave the historical preservation to the people who study historical preservation. And, for me, it's more like things like, for example, like the violence that was used to demolish the theater. I think it was demolished like in the middle of the night or something. It was still dark outside. And the activists that were inside the building were like taken out by police force, right? So there's a level of like kind of police brutality, and coupled with the illegal demolition because it happened like beforehand or something like that. Permits weren't exactly like figured out. These things, I think they have architectural presence, and I think they can definitely come into our design process. So it's a much more kind of nonverbal way of tying in these kind of layers of complexity and history of a site. And with my work, I brought that particular example up because I'm interested much more in these sort of like the very violent and the very kind of conflict and tension sort of sites rather than a different, like another kind of site. So it's not necessarily about the specific condition itself, it's just one example of like a few different examples.
And to go on with that, and I think we'll probably have to wrap up after this. And the last question is like, what's next from Shirley Lopez? But this idea of starting with the prism and starting in this very kind of clean space and scale of the digital fabrication tools and the architectural drawing. Are you thinking about how to take these methods of producing, right, into sites that exist already with history and that have forms there already to contend with?
It's an interesting problem. I'm not sure, but I think, and I'm happy that you brought out the primitive, the rectangular extrusion again, because again, like in relation to that last question, in terms of site specificity, so to illustrate again, like, for example, if I were to think about a proposal on the site, I would not start with the previous footprint of the previous theater, for example. I think like this, like starting with a kind of like a digital primitive or something, it actually kind of like offers a more of a neutral ground, which might be productive in dealing in then inserting all these other kinds of layers. But in terms of the sort of like the question of production, I don't think I will ever stop bringing in methods of productions like into the design process at equal strength as anything else that would be a part of that process. So I think for me, I am really interested, and again, like I typically say production rather than fabrication, because I think there is like there's a difference between the two. Like I'm interested in sort of like how things kind of can be kind of like massaged into finance, but how they come together, how they can be malleable, how they can allow for other kinds of like unexpected things to take place. But ultimately, I am interested in the thing that I'm making, in it gaining its own agency and gaining its own language, and it being in the world just like I am in the world in a way.
Thank you. One last question, easy one.
Okay.
Easy one, fast. From Evan Molina, how long did the digitally fabricated components take to create and then assemble for the project presented last, the understory project?
The entirety of the project?
I think we're talking about labor here. Right?
Well, it's not necessarily how long, it's how many people were involved. And in total, it was a team of 6 people. I want to say it took about 3 months from, a very basic, messy Rhino model to it being opened. Which with that, I think it took an enormous sort of digital expertise, which I'm not putting down by any means, but it took an enormous kind of layer of digital expertise to get that project to work. And actually, I must add, it took also 4 weeks of a highly trained machinist. So actually a team of 7. I'm gonna include him in that to make that project possible.
Yes. Any last comments from the audience? No?
Quick question. Talk about this tension between graphic and form. And I was wondering if you relate the graphic to like psychological effects and form to like sensorial effects. So it's like mind visuals, the graphics body. How does it overlap?
I haven't thought about it that way. I think like the graphic has a little bit more, for me, the graphic is a little bit more open to different kinds of potentials, because I consider a graphic condition as completely material at first. So in sort of like removing the material consequences, then like other kinds of effects can start to take place. I don't know that I think I look at both graphic and form as a psychological condition. I think they're both very much interconnected in that kind of either a physiological reaction or a sort of like that kind of like strange fusion in this like abstract space of like sensorial and physical body. I'm not sure that I've thought about them as delimited in that sense. Like I think because in my work, they're so closely interconnected and they're so mostly fighting, mostly at tension with one another, that I think they're sort of, yeah, they're kind of like equal players or equal agents in this weird fusion abstract space, I think. I have to think about it more. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
today.
you for having me.
Flying
This is
out to Lubbock
fantastic.
and spending
Thanks,
time with us.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.